I went to renew my passport, and the agent told me I had 2 valid passports, which wasn't possible. She showed me surveillance footage from airports around the world over the past 9 years. Tokyo, Moscow, Beijing, Berlin, dozens of countries I'd never visited. In every video, the man going through customs with my passport, with my name, with my biometric data, looked exactly like me. But it wasn't me. I'd never left the United States. The agent called Homeland Security. They told me the person using that second passport was my biological son, a son I never knew I had, a son who'd been living my life in parallel for nearly a decade while I worked at an auto plant in Detroit, a son who'd stolen my identity so completely that even fingerprint scanners couldn't tell us apart. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 71 years old. I live in Detroit, Michigan. I retired 3 years ago after 43 years working on the assembly line at an automotive factory. Same plant, same job essentially. 43 years of showing up, doing the work, collecting a paycheck, going home. I'm a widower. My wife Helen died 14 months ago from complications of diabetes. We'd been married for 48 years. We never had children. Tried for years but couldn't conceive. Eventually accepted it would just be the 2 of us. Built a quiet life around that reality. I was born in Detroit in 1953. Grew up on the east side in a neighborhood that's mostly gone now. My father worked at an auto plant. My mother was a seamstress who took in work from home. I had 2 sisters, both older. We were a normal working-class black family. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would make you look twice. My parents died in the 1990s. My sisters both moved away. One to Atlanta, one to Los Angeles. We talk on holidays but aren't close. Haven't seen either of them in person in probably 5 years. I met Helen in 1975. She was working as a nurse at a hospital downtown. I'd come in with a broken arm from a basketball game. She'd been the one to set it. We'd started talking. She'd made me laugh despite the pain. I'd asked for her number. She'd said yes. Simple as that. We'd dated for a year. Married in 1976. Set up house in a small rental on the east side. Saved up and bought our own place in 1982. A little brick bungalow. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, small yard, nothing fancy, but it was ours. Helen worked as a nurse for 35 years. I worked at the plant. We had routines. She worked days. I worked afternoons. We'd see each other in the evenings, have dinner together, watch television, go to bed. Weekends we'd do errands, see friends occasionally, go to church on Sundays. Normal married life, the kind millions of people live. Unremarkable, but comfortable. The not having children thing was hard at first. We'd tried for 5 years. Nothing worked. We saw doctors. They ran tests. Everything came back saying we should be able to conceive, but it just wasn't happening. Eventually, we talked about adoption. But the process was expensive and complicated. We were on a tight budget, both working regular jobs but not making much. Adoption seemed out of reach, so we accepted it. Decided we'd focus on being good to each other, being good aunt and uncle to our nieces and nephews, making peace with childlessness. Helen was okay with it sooner than I was. She'd always been practical. Said if it wasn't meant to be, it wasn't meant to be. That we had each other, and that was enough. I struggled more. Felt like I'd failed somehow. Like there was something wrong with me. But eventually I came around to Helen's way of thinking. We had a good life, a good marriage. That was more than a lot of people had. When Helen got sick in 2023, it came on suddenly. She'd been tired for months. We'd thought it was just age. Both of us were in our 70s. Being tired seemed normal. But then she started losing weight, having trouble with her vision. The doctor ran tests. Diabetes. Advanced. Her kidneys were already showing damage. The doctor said if she'd caught it earlier, it would have been manageable. But this far along, treatment options were limited. Helen fought it for 8 months. Dialysis, medication, diet changes, but her body kept declining. The diabetes had done too much damage. In November of last year, she had a stroke. Died 3 days later in the hospital. I was with her when she went, holding her hand, talking to her even though she couldn't respond, telling her I loved her, that she'd been the best thing in my life, that I was grateful for every year we'd had together. After Helen died, I didn't know what to do with myself. The house felt too big and too small at the same time, too empty without her, but also closing in on me. Every room reminded me of her coffee mug still in the dish drainer, her reading glasses on the table, her sweater hanging on the back of the chair. I couldn't bring myself to move her things, but I also couldn't bear looking at them. I started taking long walks, getting out of the house for hours at a time, walking through the neighborhood, through the city, just moving to avoid sitting in that empty house. people from church checked on me, brought casseroles, invited me to dinners. I appreciated it, but mostly wanted to be alone. Grief felt private, personal, something I needed to work through by myself. By March, 14 months after Helen died, I was starting to feel like maybe I could move forward. Not move on. That seemed impossible, but move forward. Figure out how to live alone. How to build some kind of routine that didn't revolve around Helen's absence. I started thinking about traveling. Something Helen and I had always talked about, but never done. We'd taken one vacation a year, usually somewhere warm, Florida, the Caribbean, but we'd never done the big trips. Never went to Europe or Asia or any of the places Helen had dreamed about seeing. My passport had expired in 2019. I'd gotten it in 2009 and let it lapse. During the pandemic. Hadn't needed it. Hadn't been going anywhere. But now, thinking about maybe taking a trip to honor Helen's memory, I decided to renew it. Simple administrative task. Something concrete I could do. A step toward whatever came next. The passport office was in a federal building downtown. Big concrete structure with metal detectors at the entrance. Security guards checking IDs. I went on a Tuesday morning in March. Brought my expired passport, my birth certificate, my driver's license, all the required documentation. The building was busy but not crowded. I waited in line for about 15 minutes before getting called to a counter. The agent was a young woman, maybe 30. She took my paperwork without looking up, scanned my expired passport, typed something into her computer, then stopped. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She looked at the screen, looked at my passport, looked back at the screen. Her expression changed from routine boredom to confusion. She called over a supervisor, an older man in his 50s. They had a quiet conversation while looking at the computer screen. The supervisor looked at me, looked back at the screen, asked me to wait. I stood at the counter feeling the first stirrings of unease. Something was wrong. The supervisor disappeared into a back office with my passport. The young agent apologized for the delay, said there was just a small issue they needed to check. But her voice had that careful tone people use when something is actually very wrong, but they're trying not to alarm you. I waited at the counter for about 10 minutes. Other people in line were getting impatient behind me. The agent kept apologizing, kept saying it would just be another moment. Finally, the supervisor came back out. He had my passport and a manila folder. He asked if I could come with him to an office, said they needed to ask me some questions. His tone was serious, professional, the kind of voice that makes you understand you're not being given a choice. I followed him to a small, windowless office. 2 chairs, a desk, a computer. He gestured for me to sit, closed the door. The click of the latch sounded too final. He sat across from me, opened the manila folder, spread several documents across the desk. The supervisor told me there was a problem with my passport application, that according to their system, I already had a valid passport, that I couldn't have 2 passports unless I was a diplomat or had special government authorization. He asked if I'd reported a passport stolen or lost. I said no, I'd never reported anything stolen. My only passport was the expired one I'd brought in today. He turned his computer monitor so I could see. The screen showed a database entry, my name, my birth date, my social security number. But the passport number was different from the one on my expired passport. The issue date was 2015, expiration 2025, still valid. The screen showed extensive travel history, dozens of entries and exits from countries around the world: Russia, China, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan. The list went on. I told him there was a mistake, that I'd never been to any of those places, that my only passport was the expired one from 2009, that I'd used it for a few Caribbean trips but nothing more. The supervisor asked if I was sure, if maybe I'd forgotten. I said no, I hadn't forgotten. I'd never left the United States except for those Caribbean vacations. Certainly never been to Russia or China. He pulled another document from the folder, a photocopy of a passport, blue cover, gold seal, United States of America. He opened it to the photo page. The picture was my face. My name was printed below, Marcus Anthony Webb. My birth date, my place of birth, everything matched. But I'd never seen this passport before in my life. The pages of this passport were filled with stamps, entry and exit marks from dozens of countries. The most recent stamp was from December 2024, Tokyo, Japan. 3 months ago. But 3 months ago I'd been home in Detroit. I'd had knee replacement surgery in November. Was recovering. Doing physical therapy. Could barely walk. Definitely wasn't traveling to Japan. I told the supervisor this was identity theft, that someone had stolen my information, created a fake passport, had been using it to travel. The supervisor said they'd considered that, but there were complications. He pulled up another document on his computer, showed me surveillance footage from an airport. The timestamp said December 15th, 2024, Narita International Airport in Tokyo. The video showed a man approaching passport control. He was wearing dark pants and a gray jacket, carrying a small rolling suitcase. As he got closer to the camera, I could see his face clearly. It was me, not someone who looked like me. It was my face, my posture, my walk. Even the way he carried the suitcase matched how I would carry one. The man in the video approached the booth, handed over a passport. The officer scanned it, stamped it, waved him through. The man collected his passport and continued walking through the terminal until he disappeared into the crowd. I stared at the screen, feeling my chest tighten. That looked exactly like me, but it wasn't me. I'd been home in December, recovering from surgery. I told the supervisor again that I hadn't been to Tokyo, that I'd had knee surgery, that I could barely walk, that the man in that video was walking normally with no limp. That had to prove it wasn't me. The supervisor played more videos. Beijing Capital International Airport, March 2020. The same man, my face, going through customs. Moscow, Berlin, Singapore, a dozen different airports over 9 years, all showing the same man with my face using a passport with my name. Moving through international terminals like he'd done it hundreds of times. Confident, experienced, nothing hesitant or uncertain about him. I kept saying it wasn't me, that I didn't understand how this was possible, that someone had stolen my identity. The supervisor said he believed me that I hadn't personally traveled to those places, but the situation was more complicated than simple identity theft. He said he needed to call Homeland Security, that this raised significant security concerns, that I needed to stay and answer more questions. I asked if I was under arrest. He said no, but that I wasn't free to leave either, that they needed to investigate, understand what was happening. He left the office and I heard the lock click. I sat there alone, feeling my heart pound. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Someone was using my identity, traveling the world with my name and face. But how? How was that even possible? I sat in that office for maybe 20 minutes before the supervisor returned with a woman in a dark suit. She introduced herself as a Homeland Security agent, said her name was Sarah Morrison. She sat across from me, opened a tablet, asked me to walk through my whereabouts for specific dates. I told her about my life, about Helen dying, about working at the plant for 43 years, about my knee surgery in November, about never traveling internationally except for a few Caribbean vacations. Agent Morrison made notes, asked if I had anyone who could corroborate my story. I gave her my neighbor's contact information, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been checking on me daily after my surgery, bringing groceries, helping with physical therapy. She could confirm I'd been home in December when the passport showed me in Tokyo. The agent asked about my family. I told her about Helen being gone, about my sisters in other states, about not having children. She asked if I'd ever been married before Helen. I said no. She asked if I'd had any serious relationships before Helen, any girlfriends who might have gotten pregnant. I said no, nothing serious. I'd dated some in my early 20s, but nothing that lasted. Then I'd met Helen, and that was it. Agent Morrison asked if I'd be willing to give fingerprints, said they needed to compare them with the biometric data on the second passport. I said yes, whatever they needed. I wanted to figure this out as much as they did. She pulled out a portable fingerprint scanner, took prints from all 10 of my fingers. The machine beeped and whirred, uploaded the data. She waited while it processed. Then her expression changed. She looked at the screen, looked at me, looked back at the screen with something like confusion or concern. She told me my fingerprints matched the passport, that they matched exactly. I said that was impossible, that fingerprints were unique, that no one else could have my fingerprints. She agreed that was normally true, that fingerprints were one of the most reliable forms of identification. But somehow the prints on file for the second passport matched mine exactly. Every ridge, every whorl, every detail identical. I asked what that meant. She said it meant either I was lying about my travel history or something very unusual was happening. I said I wasn't lying, that I'd never been to those countries, that I could prove where I'd been. She said they'd investigate, that they'd check my story, but that in the meantime I needed to come with her to their field office for a more thorough interview. The agent drove me downtown to a federal building. We went through security, took an elevator to the 8th floor. She put me in an interview room, windowless, fluorescent lights, a table, 2 chairs. She told me to wait, that she needed to make some calls, check some records. She left and locked the door behind her. I sat in that room for over an hour. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Someone had my fingerprints, my face, my identity, had been traveling the world for years, building a parallel life I knew nothing about. But how was that possible? How do you steal someone's fingerprints? How do you make yourself look exactly like another person? When Agent Morrison finally returned, she had a thick file folder. She sat across from me, opened the folder, told me they'd been pulling my records, employment history, tax returns, medical records, everything they could access, and they'd found inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. My employment records from the auto plant showed continuous work from 1979 to 2022. No gaps, no leaves of absence. But my tax returns showed income from overseas sources in several recent years, income that wasn't reported to my employer, income that suggested I'd been working elsewhere while supposedly working full-time at the plant. I said that was impossible, that I'd only worked at the plant, that I hadn't had any other income. Agent Morrison showed me the tax returns, official IRS documents, filed in my name with my social security number, showing income from consulting work, contract work, international assignments, amounts that were significant, tens of thousands of dollars per year in addition to my plant wages, all filed properly, all documented, all showing I'd been leading some kind of double financial life. She also showed me credit reports. I had credit cards I didn't recognize, 5 different cards in my name, all with significant balances, all with charges from international locations, hotels in Moscow, restaurants in Beijing, airlines, rental cars, thousands of dollars in charges I'd never made. The statements had been going to an address in Maryland, a post office box registered in my name, a box I'd never heard of. I kept saying this was identity theft, that someone had stolen my information, created fake documents, been using my name for years. Agent Morrison said they were considering that possibility, but that the sophistication level was unusual, that the fingerprint match was particularly concerning. That simple identity theft didn't usually include biometric data that matched perfectly. She asked if I wanted to call a lawyer. I said I didn't have a lawyer, didn't know any lawyers. She said that was my right if I wanted one, that I wasn't under arrest but that I wasn't free to leave, that this was a serious investigation. I asked if she thought I was lying. She said she didn't know what to think yet, that the evidence was contradictory, that they needed to investigate further. Agent Morrison told me to go home, to stay available, to not try to leave the country. She gave me her card, said they'd be in touch, that they were sending agents to Maryland to check the post office box, that they were interviewing people at my former workplace, that they were building a complete picture. She said this could take time, weeks or months, that I needed to be patient. I went home feeling like my life had been turned inside out. Everything I thought I knew about myself was being questioned. My identity, my history, my entire existence was suddenly suspect. I sat in my living room that evening staring at the walls. Helen's photos were everywhere. Our wedding picture, vacation photos, the ordinary visual record of a marriage. But now even that felt uncertain. Had Helen known something I didn't? Had there been parts of my life I'd forgotten or blocked out? No, that was crazy. I knew who I was, knew where I'd been, knew what my life had been. I'd worked at the plant for 43 years, came home every day to Helen, had lived a completely normal life. Whatever was happening with the passports and the travel records and the financial documents, it wasn't me. It was someone else using my identity. Someone who'd figured out how to steal not just my name, but somehow my physical identity too. I spent the next week trying to document my life, prove where I'd been. I pulled out old calendars, bank statements, utility bills, anything that showed I'd been home in Detroit during the times the passport showed travel. I had decades of proof that I'd been living an ordinary life here, working, paying bills, going about normal routines. Mrs. Patterson came over when I called. I explained that I needed her to verify I'd been home in December, that there was some kind of mix-up with government records. She was confused but agreeable, said of course I'd been home. She'd seen me every day after my surgery, had helped me with groceries and laundry, had driven me to physical therapy appointments. She asked why anyone would question that. I said it was complicated, just government bureaucracy. She said she'd be happy to talk to whoever needed verification. I also contacted my former supervisor at the plant, explained I needed employment verification. He pulled my records, confirmed I'd worked there continuously from 1979 until retirement in 2022. Perfect attendance record. No unexplained absences. No leaves that weren't accounted for. He asked why I needed this verification. I gave him the same explanation I'd given Mrs. Patterson, government mix-up. He said he'd write a letter if I needed one. 2 weeks passed with no word from Homeland Security. I called Agent Ho, Morrison's number several times, left messages. She never called back. The waiting was worse than the interrogation, not knowing what they were finding, what they were thinking, whether I was going to be arrested, whether my entire life was about to collapse based on evidence I couldn't explain. Then, one morning, 3 weeks after the passport office incident, there was a knock on my door, heavy, official. I opened it to find Agent Morrison and another agent I didn't recognize. They asked if they could come in. I stepped aside, let them into my living room. They sat on the couch. I sat in my recliner. Agent Morrison opened her tablet. She told me they'd made significant progress in their investigation, that what they'd found was disturbing. She said the post office box in Maryland had been used to receive mail related to the credit cards and the overseas activities. They'd obtained surveillance footage from the postal facility. The person accessing that box was a man in his late 40s, black, tall, strong build, and his face was my face from 30 years ago. I said I didn't understand. Agent Morrison pulled up a photo on her tablet, turned it so I could see. A man maybe 48 years old, dark skin, close-cropped hair, strong features, and he looked like me. Not exactly, but close enough that we could be related. Close enough that you'd assume we were family if you saw us together. Agent Morrison said this man's name was David Webb, that he was 48 years old, that he lived in Baltimore, and that according to DNA records they'd accessed, he was my biological son. I said that was impossible, that I didn't have a son, that Helen and I had never had children, that we'd tried but couldn't conceive. Agent Morrison said David Webb was born in 1976, that his birth certificate listed his mother as a woman named Carol Jenkins, that I was listed as the father, that they'd run DNA comparison using records from a medical database, and David Webb was genetically my son. There was no question. I sat there feeling the room spin. 1976. That was 48 years ago. I'd been 23. I'd met Helen in 1975. We'd started dating, gotten serious quickly, married in 1976. But before Helen, I'd dated some. Casually. Nothing serious. Nothing that had seemed important enough to remember in detail decades later. Carol Jenkins. The name meant nothing. I tried to think back to 1975 and 1976. Tried to remember women I'd dated. I'd gone to a few parties, met people. There'd been a woman I'd seen for maybe a month. I couldn't remember her name. It might have been Carol, but it hadn't been serious. We'd gone out a few times. Then I'd met Helen, and that was it. I'd stopped seeing anyone else, focused completely on Helen. Could that woman have gotten pregnant? Could she have had my child and never told me? Could I have a son I'd known nothing about for 48 years? Agent Morrison said David Webb had grown up with his mother in Baltimore, that Carol Jenkins had raised him as a single mother, that she'd told David his father was someone named Marcus Webb from Detroit, but hadn't provided more details, that Carol had died in 2010, that afterward David had started searching for me, had tracked me down through public records, had found where I lived and worked, but David hadn't contacted me, hadn't introduced himself. Instead, he'd started studying me, learning about my life, and about 9 years ago, he'd begun using my identity for his own purposes. He'd somehow obtained my biometric data, had created a second passport in my name, had been traveling internationally for work that required anonymity and a clean identity, corporate espionage, intelligence contracting, things that operated in gray legal areas, things that required someone who looked ordinary, someone with no criminal record, someone like me. The other agent, whose name was Rodriguez, explained how David had done it. He said David and I shared enough genetic similarity that with some sophisticated techniques, fingerprints could be altered to match more closely, that our faces were similar enough that with minor prosthetics or just aging differences, David could pass as me, especially in brief encounters with passport control officers who saw thousands of faces every day. That David had been smart about it, had never used the fake identity in places I might be, had never done anything that would raise flags until I'd tried to renew my passport and the system had caught the duplication. I asked why David would do this. Why not just contact me? Why steal my identity instead of having a relationship? Agent Morrison said they were still investigating David's motives, but what they knew so far was that David had complicated feelings about me. I'd gotten his mother pregnant, and apparently never knew about it, had gone on to live a happy life with someone else while Carol struggled to raise a child alone. David had grown up without a father, had spent his life wondering about me. When he'd finally found me, he'd been angry, resentful, had decided to use my identity instead of trying to know me as a person. She said David's work required international travel and anonymity. He couldn't use his own identity because of the nature of what he did. Using my identity gave him a clean cover. A person with decades of normal, boring life. No red flags, no suspicions. Perfect for someone who needed to move through the world unnoticed. Agent Morrison said they'd arrested David 3 days ago in Baltimore, that he was being charged with identity theft, passport fraud, and several other federal crimes, that he'd be facing significant prison time. She said David had admitted everything, had explained how he'd obtained my biometric data, how he'd been using my identity, how he'd managed to keep it going for 9 years without detection. I asked if I could meet him, meet this son I'd never known existed. Agent Morrison said that would be up to David, that he was in federal custody, that I could request a meeting but he didn't have to agree. She said she'd pass along my request, see what David said. Then Agent Morrison told me I was clear, that they'd verified my story, that Mrs. Patterson had confirmed my whereabouts, that my employment records checked out, that I was clearly the victim of identity theft, not a participant in whatever David had been doing. She apologized for the investigation, for the suspicions, for the difficulty of the past few weeks, said it was an unusual case, that they'd had to be thorough. After they left, I sat in my living room trying to process everything. I had a son, a 48-year-old son I'd never met, never known about, a son whose mother had been someone I'd barely remembered, someone I'd dated casually nearly 50 years ago, and then forgotten about when I'd met Helen, Carol Jenkins. I tried to remember her clearly. It was like reaching through fog. I remembered a woman I'd met at a party. We'd talked, exchanged numbers, gone out a few times. I remembered liking her but not feeling any deep connection. Then I'd met Helen, and that had been different. That had felt important. I'd stopped calling Carol, moved on, never thought about her again, except apparently Carol had been pregnant, had our baby, had raised him alone. She'd known where to find me, my name, that I lived in Detroit, but she'd never contacted me, never told me I had a son. Why? Had she been ashamed? Angry? Had she not wanted me in David's life? Had she thought I wouldn't care? I'd never know now. Carol was dead, had been for 14 years. Whatever her reasons, she'd taken them to her grave. Left David with questions I couldn't answer. Left me with a son I'd never had the chance to know. Agent Morrison called 2 days later, said David had agreed to meet me, that it would be at the detention facility where he was being held, that I'd have 30 minutes, that an agent would be present, that I should prepare myself. David was angry, might say things that were hurtful, might not be interested in any kind of relationship, but if I wanted to meet him, this was my chance. I drove to Baltimore the following week. The detention facility was a low concrete building surrounded by fences. Security was intense, metal detectors, ID checks, pat-downs. They led me to a meeting room, small table, 2 chairs, a glass partition with phones for communication, like something from a movie. I sat on one side and waited. David was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit. His hands were cuffed. A guard escorted him to the chair across from me. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. He looked like me at that age. Same bone structure, same eyes, same way of holding his shoulders, but his expression was hard, guarded. He picked up the phone on his side. I picked up mine. We stared at each other for a long moment, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, I told him I didn't know, that I'd never known Carol was pregnant, that if I'd known, I would have been there, would have been a father to him, would have tried to do right by him and Carol both. David's expression didn't change. He said his mother had told him I'd known, that she'd told me she was pregnant, and I'd walked away, that I'd chosen my new girlfriend over my responsibility to him, that I'd been a coward who'd abandoned them both. I said that wasn't true, that Carol had never told me, that I'd dated her briefly in early 1976, that we'd stopped seeing each other when I met Helen, that I'd had no idea Carol was pregnant, that if she'd tried to contact me, I never received the message. David said I was lying, that his mother wouldn't have lied to him his whole life, that I was trying to rewrite history, make myself look better. He said he'd spent his childhood wondering why his father didn't want him, wondering what was wrong with him that I'd chosen to stay away. It had shaped his entire life, made him angry, made him determined to prove he didn't need me. I told him I understood his anger, that he had every right to be furious, but that I was telling the truth. I hadn't known. If I'd known, everything would have been different. I'd have married Carol, raised him, been his father. I'd never have chosen to abandon a child. David laughed, said it was easy to say that now that he'd been caught, now that I knew about him. But where had I been for 48 years? Where had I been when he was growing up without a father? Where had I been when his mother was struggling to raise him alone? I'd been living my comfortable life in Detroit, working my job, playing house with my wife, never thinking about the woman I'd gotten pregnant and left behind. I said I hadn't known there was a woman I'd left behind, that Carol and I had dated casually, that it hadn't been serious, that when we stopped seeing each other, I'd assumed that was mutual, that we'd both moved on. I hadn't known she was pregnant, hadn't known there was a child, hadn't known I had a son. David asked if I'd tried to find him. Once I found out. Once Agent Morrison told me about him. Had I tried to track him down? Or had I just been relieved when they said I wasn't in trouble? When they said I was the victim, I admitted I'd been shocked, overwhelmed. That learning I had a son at 71 years old was something I was still trying to process. But that, yes, I'd asked to meet him. That's why I was here, because I wanted to know him, wanted to understand who he was, wanted some kind of relationship even though it was 48 years too late. David said it was too late, that he didn't need a father now, that he'd spent his whole life without one. He'd made peace with that, or at least he'd thought he had. Then he'd found me, tracked me down, seen me living my ordinary life, working at the plant, coming home to my wife, being a normal person, while he'd grown up thinking I was some kind of monster who'd abandoned him. Seeing that I was just ordinary had made him angrier, made him feel cheated. If I'd been terrible, it would have made sense, would have justified his mother's choice to keep me away, but I was just normal, just regular. There was nothing wrong with me that explained why I hadn't been his father, so David had decided to use me, take my identity, use my ordinary, boring, clean record as a cover for work that required anonymity. It had felt like justice, like taking from me the way I'd taken from him, taking my name, my face, my fingerprints, my entire identity, and using it for his own purposes while I lived obliviously in Detroit. He said he'd been careful, had never done anything in Detroit, had never gone anywhere I might be, had kept our lives completely separate, had been planning to do it for years more, maybe decades, until I died, and he could take over my identity completely. But I'd ruined it by trying to renew my passport. That simple administrative task had exposed everything, had ended David's operation, had gotten him arrested, had destroyed the life he'd built. And for what? So I could take some trip to honor my dead wife? So I could feel better about my boring, ordinary life? I told David I was sorry. Sorry for everything. Sorry he'd grown up without a father. Sorry Carol had struggled alone. Sorry I hadn't known. Sorry I couldn't go back and change the past. But that I was here now, that I wanted to know him. That it wasn't too late to have some kind of relationship. David said it was too late. That he was going to prison. That by the time he got out, I'd probably be dead. That whatever chance we might have had was gone. He said he didn't forgive me, didn't believe I hadn't known about him, didn't want a relationship, wanted me to leave him alone, let him serve his time, move on with whatever life he'd have afterward, without me. The guard signaled that our time was up. David stood, hung up the phone without saying goodbye, walked away without looking back. I sat there watching him go. This son I'd never known. This man who carried my face and my name but felt like a complete stranger. The glass partition between us felt symbolic. We were separated by more than physical barriers, separated by decades of misunderstanding and anger and missed chances. I drove back to Detroit feeling hollowed out, empty. I'd wanted the meeting to bring some kind of resolution, some understanding, maybe even the beginning of a relationship. Instead, it had just confirmed how far apart David and I were, how impossible it would be to bridge 48 years of absence. But I couldn't stop thinking about what David had said, about Carol telling him I'd known about the pregnancy, about her telling him I'd walked away. Had she really said that? Or had David misunderstood? Children sometimes fill in gaps in ways that make sense to them. Maybe Carol had never explicitly said I'd known. Maybe she'd just said I'd left. And David had assumed that meant I'd known and chosen to leave. Or maybe Carol had lied. Maybe she'd been hurt when I'd stopped calling, when I'd moved on to Helen. Maybe she'd been angry and had told David a story that made her feel better. A story where I was the villain who'd knowingly abandoned them, where she was the victim who'd bravely raised a child alone after being abandoned. People rewrite history to make sense of their pain. Maybe that's what Carol had done. I'd never know now. Carol was gone. David believed what he believed, and I had no way to prove the truth. No way to show that I'd genuinely not known. That I would have stepped up if I'd had the chance. That I wasn't the man Carol had apparently told David I was. Over the following weeks, I tried to piece together what had actually happened in 1976. I called my sisters, asked if they remembered me dating someone named Carol before I met Helen. My older sister remembered vaguely, said there'd been a woman I'd brought to a family dinner once. Early 1976, she couldn't remember the name but thought it might have been Carol, said the woman had seemed nice, quiet, that I'd seemed to like her but not be serious about her. My sister asked why I was asking about a woman from nearly 50 years ago. I told her part of the story, that I'd discovered I might have a son from that relationship, that the mother had never told me. My sister was shocked, asked if I was sure. I said DNA didn't lie, that I had a son I'd never known about, a son who was now in prison for stealing my identity. My sister didn't know what to say to that. None of us did. It was too strange, too complicated, too painful. She said she was sorry, that it must be hard, that she'd help if she could but didn't know how. I thanked her, said I was just trying to understand what had happened. I went through old boxes in my basement, looking for anything from 1976. I found some photos, a few letters, nothing about Carol, but I found my address book from back then, handwritten entries, names and phone numbers of people I'd known. I flipped through looking for Carol Jenkins, found nothing, but there was an entry for Carol, no last name, just Carol with a phone number. The number had been crossed out. I'd probably crossed it out after we'd stopped seeing each other. After I'd started dating Helen exclusively, I stared at that crossed-out number. That was the only evidence Carol Jenkins had ever existed in my life. One entry in an old address book. A phone number I'd deleted after a few weeks of casual dating. That's how little she'd meant to me at the time. How insignificant that relationship had been. I'd forgotten her completely, moved on without a second thought. But for Carol, apparently, it had been different. She'd been pregnant, had my child, had raised him alone while I'd built a life with someone else. However brief our relationship had been for me, it had changed Carol's entire life, had given her a son, had made her a single mother, had altered everything about her future, and she'd never told me, had chosen to handle it, alone. Why? I'd been young, but not irresponsible. If she'd told me she was pregnant, I'd like to think I'd have done the right thing. I'd been raised to take responsibility, to not walk away from my obligations. My parents had taught me that, but maybe Carol hadn't trusted that. Maybe she'd thought I'd deny the child was mine, or pressure her to terminate the pregnancy, or offer money, and then disappear. Maybe she'd decided she was better off raising David alone than dealing with me at all? Or maybe she had tried to tell me. Maybe she'd called that crossed-out number after I'd stopped calling her. Maybe she'd left messages I never got. Maybe she'd tried to reach me, and I'd been too focused on Helen to notice. Maybe I had abandoned her, just not consciously, not deliberately, but through neglect and thoughtlessness and being young and selfish. I'd never know. The past was the past. Carol was gone. David believed what he believed, and I was left with this strange new reality. I was a father, had been a father for 48 years without knowing it, had a son who'd lived his entire life without me, who'd grown up, become an adult, built a career, all while I'd been completely unaware of his existence. Agent Morrison called in April, said David's case was moving through the courts, that he'd pleaded guilty to the identity theft and passport fraud charges, that he'd be sentenced in a few months. She said the prosecutor was recommending 10 years. With good behavior, David might serve 7 or 8. He'd be in his mid-50s when he got out. She asked if I was planning to attend the sentencing, if I wanted to give a victim impact statement. I said I didn't know, that David was both the person who'd victimized me and also my son, that I didn't know how to think about that, how to balance those two realities. Agent Morrison said I had time to decide, that the sentencing wasn't for another 2 months, that I should think about what I wanted to say, if anything. I thought about it constantly. What would I say? That David had stolen my identity, but I understood why? That I was angry, but also felt guilty? That I wanted justice, but also wanted mercy for my own son? Nothing felt right. Every sentiment was complicated by the relationship we did and didn't have. I decided to write David a letter. Not about the crimes, not about the sentencing, just about everything else. About Carol, about 1976, about what I remembered and what I didn't, about what I wished had been different, about wanting to know him even though he didn't want to know me. The letter took me weeks to write. I went through dozens of drafts, trying to find words that were honest without being defensive, trying to acknowledge David's pain without making it about my own. trying to reach across the gulf between us even though I didn't know if David would read it or care. I wrote about meeting Carol, about how young I'd been, how thoughtless, how I'd dated her casually without considering that she might be developing deeper feelings, how I'd stopped calling when I'd met Helen without giving Carol any real explanation, how I'd been selfish in the way young men often are, not malicious but not considerate either. I wrote about Helen, about our marriage, about trying to have children and failing, about accepting childlessness and building a life around that reality, about never knowing there was a child out there, a son, someone who should have been part of our family but wasn't because of choices and circumstances and failures of communication that had happened decades ago. I wrote about finding out about David, about the shock, the confusion, the strange feeling of discovering you're a father at 71, about wanting to know him, about understanding his anger but wishing we could get past it, about having so few years left and wanting to spend some of them being David's father, even though it was 48 years too late. I wrote about regret, about wishing I could go back to 1976 and do things differently, not just with Carol, but with everything, about wishing I'd been more thoughtful, more careful, more aware that my actions affected other people in ways I couldn't see, about wishing Carol had felt she could tell me, about wishing David had grown up with a father, about wishing our whole family could have been together instead of fractured by secrets and distance. I ended the letter by telling David I loved him, that I knew that was strange to say to someone I'd barely met, someone who was essentially a stranger, but that he was my son, that biology mattered even when history was complicated, that I wanted to be in his life in whatever way he'd allow, that I'd wait as long as it took, that when he got out of prison, I'd be there if he wanted me, that it still wasn't too late if he didn't want it to be. I sent the letter through Agent Morrison, asked her to make sure David received it. She said she would. Said she couldn't guarantee he'd read it, but that she'd deliver it. That was all I could ask for. The sentencing hearing was in June. I drove to Baltimore, sat in the back of the courtroom. David was brought in wearing a suit instead of the orange jumpsuit. He looked smaller somehow, older, tired. He glanced around the courtroom. His eyes passed over me without recognition, or maybe with recognition, but without acknowledgement. I couldn't tell. The prosecutor gave his statement, outlined David's crimes, the identity theft, the passport fraud, the years of deception, the international travel under false pretenses, the financial fraud, the magnitude of what David had done. He recommended 10 years, said David had shown sophisticated criminal capability, that he'd been operating without remorse until he'd been caught, that he needed significant prison time to understand the seriousness of his actions. David's lawyer argued for leniency, talked about David's childhood, growing up without a father, being raised by a single mother who struggled, financially, feeling abandoned and angry. The lawyer said David's crimes weren't about greed, they were about pain, about trying to take something back from the father who'd taken everything from him. It was a sympathetic narrative, but also one that made me sound like a villain. The judge asked if David wanted to speak. David stood, said he took responsibility for what he'd done, that he knew it was wrong, that he'd hurt people, including me, but that he'd been carrying anger for so long he didn't know how to put it down, that discovering I'd been living an ordinary life while he'd grown up thinking I'd abandoned him had broken something in him, had made him want to hurt me the way he'd been hurt. David said he'd read my letter, that he appreciated what I'd written, that he was starting to understand maybe his mother hadn't told him the whole truth, that maybe I really hadn't known, but that understanding that intellectually didn't change how he felt emotionally. He'd spent 48 years being angry at a father who'd abandoned him, learning that father hadn't actually abandoned him, but had simply been ignorant, didn't make the anger go away, just complicated it. The judge listened, asked David some questions, then announced the sentence. 8 years, less than the prosecutor had recommended. The judge said he saw mitigating factors, the difficult childhood, the mother who'd apparently lied, or at least omitted important truths, the father who'd been genuinely unaware, but that David was an adult who'd made calculated criminal choices, who'd maintained his crimes for years, who'd shown sophistication and premeditation. 8 years was appropriate given all the circumstances. David accepted the sentence without visible reaction, was led out of the courtroom. I sat there feeling strange. My son had just been sentenced to 8 years in prison. 8 years I'd be in my late 70s by the time he got out. Might not live that long. Might die before David was free. before we had any chance at a relationship. As I was leaving the courthouse, Agent Morrison stopped me, said David had asked her to give me something. She handed me an envelope, David's handwriting on the front, my name. I opened it right there in the hallway. The note inside was brief. It said, "I believe you didn't know. I'm sorry I used your identity. I'm sorry for everything. Maybe when I get out, if you're still alive, we can try to know each other. I'm not ready now, but maybe someday. Thank you for the letter. Thank you for coming to the sentencing. It mattered. David." I read it 3 times, standing there in the courthouse hallway. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't reconciliation, wasn't even really acceptance, but it was something, a crack in the wall between us, a possibility that someday, somehow, we might be able to build something, father and son, even though the timing was all wrong, even though we'd missed 48 years, even though nothing about this would ever be normal or simple. I went home to Detroit, back to my empty house. Helen's presence was still everywhere, her photos, her things, her absence. But now there was something else too, knowledge of David, this son I'd never known, this complication in my history, this person who carried my DNA and my face but who I didn't know at all. I started visiting David, once a month. The prison allowed visitors. I'd drive to Maryland, go through security, sit in the visiting room. Sometimes David would agree to see me, sometimes he wouldn't. On the days he agreed, we'd sit across from each other and try to have conversations. Awkward, stilted, both of us unsure what to say. I told David about Helen, about our marriage, about the life we'd built. David told me about Carol, about growing up in Baltimore, about his mother's struggles, about the jobs he'd had, the life he'd lived. We traded histories, tried to fill in the gaps, tried to understand who the other person was. Sometimes David was angry, would bring up old resentments, old pain. I'd listen, wouldn't defend myself, would just acknowledge that yes, he'd been hurt. Yes, his childhood had been harder than it should have been. Yes, he'd deserved to have a father. Sometimes David was sad, would talk about Carol, about missing her, about wishing she'd told the truth, about wishing things had been different. I'd listen to that too, share his grief for a woman I'd barely known but who'd shaped both our lives. Sometimes David was curious, would ask questions about me, about my parents, about my sisters, about his extended family, about his genetic history, about where he came from beyond just Carol. I'd answer everything, tell him stories, share photos, try to give him the context he'd never had. The visits didn't feel like father and son, more like 2 strangers becoming acquaintances, building familiarity slowly, learning each other's patterns, but it was something, more than we'd had before, more than David had expected to want. In the 2nd year of David's sentence, I was diagnosed with cancer, prostate. The doctor said it was slow growing, that with treatment I probably had years left, but that I was 73, that my body was aging, that I should prepare for the reality that I might not have decades ahead of me. I told David during my next visit. He reacted more strongly than I'd expected, got angry, said it wasn't fair, that we'd just started to know each other, that we'd barely had any time, that I couldn't die before he got out, before we had a chance at a real relationship. His anger was grief. I understood that. He'd already lost Carol, didn't want to lose me too. The cancer treatment was difficult, radiation, fatigue, side effects that made daily life harder. But I kept visiting David when I was well enough, kept driving to Maryland once a month, kept sitting in that visiting room trying to build a relationship with a son I'd discovered too late. David softened as I got sicker, became less angry, more present, more willing to be vulnerable. He started calling me Dad sometimes, tentatively, testing how it felt, how it sounded. I'd respond, try to be what a father should be, even though neither of us really knew what that meant. In the 3rd year, David told me about Carol's final days. She'd died of breast cancer in 2010, had been sick for months. David had been with her at the end. She'd been heavily medicated, in and out of consciousness, but in one of her lucid moments, she'd told David the truth, that she'd never actually told me she was pregnant, that I hadn't known, that she'd lied to David about that his whole life. Carol had told David she'd been scared, young, didn't know how to tell me. By the time she'd worked up the courage to call, I'd already married Helen, already started a new life. It had felt too late, like she'd missed her chance. So she'd decided to raise David alone, had told him a story that made that choice seem justified. That made me the villain, instead of Carol having to admit she'd been too scared to reach out. Carol had apologized to David with some of her last words, had said she was sorry for lying, sorry for making him grow up thinking his father had abandoned him. sorry for creating anger that had shaped David's whole life. She'd wanted David to know the truth before she died. But then she'd died, and David had been left with that truth, not knowing what to do with it. David said he'd spent 4 years sitting on that information, knowing I hadn't abandoned him, but still carrying all the anger he'd built up over decades. The anger had become part of his identity. He didn't know how to let it go just because the facts had changed. So he'd tracked me down, had watched me, had stolen my identity, had tried to hurt me the way he'd been hurt, even though I hadn't actually done what he'd thought I'd done. He said he understood now that was wrong, that his mother's lie had created a cascade of pain and bad choices, that if Carol had just told me in 1976, everything would have been different. I'd have been his father. He'd have grown up knowing me. We'd have had a normal relationship instead of this strange, broken thing we were trying to build in a prison visiting room. I told David I didn't blame him for being angry, that he'd been lied to his whole life, that anger was a natural response, that I was just glad we'd finally found each other, that we were getting this chance. Even if it was late, even if it was imperfect, it was more than we'd had before. In the 4th year, I got sicker. The cancer had spread despite treatment. The doctors gave me maybe another year, maybe less. I told David during a visit. He cried, actually broke down crying in the visiting room, said he didn't want to lose me, that we'd barely had any time, that it wasn't fair. I said life often wasn't fair, but that we'd made the most of what we'd had, that I was grateful for these 4 years of visits, for getting to know him, for being his father even in this limited way, for the relationship we'd managed to build despite everything working against us. David asked if I'd wait for him, if I'd hold on until he got out. He still had 4 years left on his sentence. I'd be 77 by then. The doctors said I probably wouldn't make it that long. I told David I'd try, that I'd fight as hard as I could, but that he needed to prepare for the possibility that I wouldn't make it, that he'd get out and I'd be gone. David said if that happened, he'd visit my grave, would tell me about his life, would be the son I'd wanted even if I wasn't there to see it, would live in a way that would make me proud. That was all I could ask for. The prison granted David early release after 5 years for good behavior and because I was dying. Compassionate release. They approved it in December 2029. David got out just before Christmas. I was 76, weak, on hospice care, but alive to see my son walk free. David came straight to Detroit from Maryland, showed up at my door on a cold December evening. We hugged, really hugged, for the first time ever, father and son, in my living room, in the house where Helen and I had built our life, where I'd lived alone since she'd died, where I was now dying myself, but not alone because my son was here. David moved into my spare bedroom, said he'd stay as long as I needed him, as long as I was alive, would take care of me the way a son should, would be present for this final chapter, would make up for all the years we'd lost. We both knew we only had weeks or maybe months, but we'd have them together. We spent those final weeks talking. I told David everything about my life, about growing up in Detroit, about working at the plant, about Helen, about the ordinary, unremarkable life I'd lived. David told me about his life, about Carol, about Baltimore, about the choices he'd made, about prison, about who he wanted to be now that he was free. I introduced David to my sisters, to my friends, to the neighbors who'd known me for decades. I told everyone this was my son, the son I'd never known about, the son who'd come home. People were confused, had questions, but they accepted it, welcomed David, included him in the community that had been mine. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor who'd been so kind after Helen died, embraced David like he was her own grandson, brought over food, checked on us daily, made sure David knew he had support, that he wasn't alone in taking care of me, that the community would help however they could. I revised my will, left everything to David, the house, my savings, my pension benefits. It wasn't much, but it was something, a foundation David could build on, a way to help him start over after prison, after everything. My sisters understood, said it was right, that David was my son, that he deserved whatever I could give him. On a Sunday morning in February 2030, I woke up knowing it was time. My body was shutting down. The pain was manageable only because of the medication that kept me mostly unconscious, but I had a few lucid hours. David was there, sitting beside my bed, holding my hand. I told David I loved him, that I was proud of him, that I was grateful we'd found each other, that I was sorry we'd had so little time, but that I'd treasured every moment, that he'd made my final years meaningful in ways I hadn't expected, that being his father, even for just these 5 years, had been one of the great privileges of my life. David told me he loved me too, that he was sorry for all the anger, for stealing my identity, for wasting time on resentment instead of relationship, but that he was grateful we'd gotten past it, that we'd built something real, that he'd carry me with him, that he'd live in a way that honored what we'd become to each other. I told David about Helen, that she'd have loved him, that she'd have welcomed him into our family, that she'd have been a wonderful grandmother if David ever had children, that I wished she could have known him, that I wished we all could have been a family together. David said maybe we were a family, just a strange, broken, reassembled one, but a family nonetheless. 3 people who'd never quite fit together in life, but who'd loved each other in their own complicated ways. Helen, who'd wanted a child, me, who'd had a child without knowing, David, who'd grown up without a father, all connected by loss and longing and the strange accidents of life that bring people together and keep them apart. I closed my eyes, felt David's hand in mine, felt the weight of my 76 years, felt the love that had somehow grown between a father and son who'd met too late but had made the most of what little time they'd had. I died that afternoon, February 16th, 2030. David was with me, holding my hand, being the son I'd never known I had, the son who'd become real to me only in the final years of my life, the son who'd carry forward whatever legacy I had to leave. David buried me next to Helen, put both our names on the headstone, added a line, beloved husband, devoted father. That last part was new, hadn't been true for most of my life, had only become true at the very end, but David insisted, said I'd earned it, said those 5 years of being his father counted, mattered, made me worthy of that title. David stayed in Detroit, kept my house, got a job, started rebuilding his life. He visits my grave regularly, tells me about what he's doing, about the life he's building, about the man he's becoming, about the father he remembers me being even though our time was so brief. Sometimes David brings flowers. Sometimes he just sits. Sometimes he brings problems he's working through, asks what I'd think, what I'd advise, talks to me like I'm still there, still his father, still part of his life even though I'm gone. He's told me he's dating someone, a woman named Angela, that it's serious, that he thinks she might be the one. He's asked what I think, if I'd approve. I can't answer, but I think he knows. I'd approve. I'd be happy. I'd want him to have what Helen and I had, what Carol and I should have had. Love, partnership, family. David's told me he wants children someday, that he wants to be the father he never had, the father I tried to be in those final years, that he wants to break the cycle of absence and pain, build something better, something whole, something that doesn't require prison visits and deathbed reconciliations to make it real. I believe he will. I believe David will be an extraordinary father, will give his children what he never had, will create the family that should have existed all along, will make something beautiful out of all the brokenness. My story is strange. I discovered at 71 that I had a son, that I'd been a father for 48 years without knowing it, that a woman I'd dated briefly had carried that secret to her grave, that my son had stolen my identity because he'd thought I'd abandoned him, that we'd only gotten to know each other because that theft had been discovered. Most fathers have decades with their children, childhoods, adolescence, young adulthood, all the ordinary moments that build a relationship. I had 5 years, 4 of them with David in prison, 1 with him free, but those 5 years mattered, changed both of us, gave us something neither of us had known we needed. David calls himself my son now, without hesitation, without qualification, just states it as fact. Marcus Webb's son. He's made peace with all the complexity, with Carol's lies, with my ignorance, with the years we lost, with the time we had. He's integrated all of it into his understanding of who he is. I never got to be a young father, never got to raise David, never got to see him grow up, never got to be there for first days of school or graduations or any of the milestones I'd imagined when Helen and I were trying to have children. But I got to be an old father, got to know David as a man, got to build a relationship based on who we actually were rather than who we might have been, got to love him, got to be loved by him, got to die knowing I had a son who'd remember me. That's more than I'd had before the passport office, before the discovery, before everything unraveled and then came back together in a different configuration. I'd thought I was childless, thought my life would end with no one to carry my name or my memory forward. Turns out I was wrong. Turns out I had a son all along. Turns out biology finds a way even when circumstances conspire against it. David Webb is my son. That's true now in a way it never was before. We made it true through prison visits and difficult conversations and learning to see each other clearly, through forgiveness and acceptance and choosing relationship over resentment, through 5 years that mattered more than the 48 years we'd missed. I went to renew my passport and discovered I had a son. That's how my story ends. Not with the ending I'd expected, not with growing old, alone, but with being a father, even late, even imperfectly, even briefly, with giving David something he'd needed his whole life, and receiving something I'd wanted but thought I'd never have. A child, a legacy, someone to remember me when I'm gone. Did you like my story? Which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story with love and respect.